Ancient Egypt was not sustained by war every day. It endured through rhythm, through repetition, through habits so ordinary they rarely entered history books. Tonight is not about scandal and not about forbidden stories whispered too loudly. It is about a quieter question. When an entire civilization depends on stability, where does it place its trust? Pause for a moment, because the answer does not lie in monuments or battles. It rests in places designed to remain unseen, unchanged, and remarkably quiet. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you're welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and lets these nights continue. Now, rest. Before we talk about rule, law, or command, we need to notice something simpler. In ancient Egypt, power did not begin on the throne. When we imagine power in the ancient world, we instinctively picture the obvious things: thrones carved from stone, processions heavy with gold, decrees announced aloud so that everyone knows who is in charge. Power, in our modern imagination, is loud. It declares itself. It insists on being seen. Ancient Egypt worked differently. Here, power did not need to shout. It needed to remain intact. The king did not rule only through commands or punishments or military presence. He ruled by continuing to exist in the correct way. His authority was not anchored solely in law, but in appearance, rhythm, and physical continuity. As long as he was present, upright, recognizable, and seemingly unchanged, the system could breathe. The body of the king mattered more than his voice. This is a difficult idea for modern minds to absorb, because we are used to leaders being evaluated by numbers, policies, and performance metrics. Today, leaders must prove competence through results. Back then, competence was visual. If the king looked stable, the country was assumed to be stable. If he appeared whole, the world was assumed to be holding together. It was not about charisma. It was about reassurance. The king's body functioned as a living symbol, a constant reference point in a society deeply invested in order. Not dramatic order, not revolutionary order, but the quiet kind that repeats itself day after day, the kind that allows farmers to wake up and expect the same horizon they saw yesterday, the kind that keeps a civilization from exhausting itself. This is why Egyptian kings are almost never shown aging. In reliefs and statues, decades pass without leaving a mark. Wrinkles do not accumulate. Backs do not bend. Faces do not soften or weaken. The king remains eternally recognizable, eternally complete. This was not vanity. It was infrastructure. A visibly declining king would have been unsettling, not because aging was shameful, but because it suggested movement, change, drift, and drift was dangerous. The role of the king was not to innovate daily. It was to embody continuity so completely that change felt unnecessary. Think of him less as a ruler and more as a metronome. As long as the beat stayed steady, everything else could fall into place around it. This is why illness at the top was treated with such care, not only because of personal concern, but because weakness was contagious in a symbolic sense. If the king faltered, people worried, not loudly, not rebelliously, but quietly. And quiet anxiety is far more destabilizing than loud complaint. A coughing king was not just a sick man, he was a question mark. and so the body became a public matter, even when hidden behind palace walls. There were attendants, physicians, caretakers, observers. The goal was not perfection. The goal was consistency. Appearances mattered not because they were deceptive, but because they were stabilizing. This is where modern humor quietly enters the story. Today, leaders stand in front of charts and dashboards to show progress. Back then, progress was implied if the king simply showed up looking fine. No visible collapse, no dramatic absence, no alarming deviation from yesterday. In that sense, ancient leadership had a surprisingly low bar. You did not need to impress. You needed to persist. But do not mistake simplicity for fragility. This system was remarkably resilient precisely because it avoided constant performance. The king did not have to prove himself anew each morning. He had to remain legible, predictable, present. This predictability extended beyond the public eye into spaces far removed from ceremony. The king's daily routines mattered, his rest mattered, his regularity mattered. Even his private habits contributed to the sense that the world was functioning as intended. Order in ancient Egypt was not something you imposed. It was something you maintained. And maintenance is a quieter art. It does not attract attention when it succeeds. It only becomes visible when it fails. That is why so much effort went into preserving the image of the king as complete, not flawless. Complete. The difference matters. Flawless suggests effort. Complete suggests balance. The king did not need to be extraordinary every day. He needed to be sufficient. This is where the humor gently sharpens. Imagine explaining this to a modern audience. How do we know the country was doing well? Because the king looked normal. He walked, he sat, he ate, he appeared again tomorrow. That was enough. There is something almost soothing about this approach. No endless updates, no constant evaluation, just continuity as proof of success. The palace itself reflected this philosophy. It was not designed for constant spectacle. There were grand spaces, yes, but also countless areas dedicated to routine. Living quarters, private rooms, gardens, courtyards, places designed not to impress, but to sustain. Because the king could not be exhausted. Exhaustion would show, and showing exhaustion would ripple outward. In many ways, the Egyptian state was a machine designed to protect its central symbol from disruption, not out of narcissism, but out of necessity. The king was the visible anchor. Everything else revolved quietly around that fixed point. This is why rebellion in Egypt often looks strange compared to other ancient societies. There were no constant uprisings, no dramatic cycles of overthrow. Change happened slowly, often invisibly, through succession rather than rupture. As long as the image held, the system held. This does not mean the king was passive. He worked, he decided, he traveled, he led rituals, inspections, and campaigns. But none of that mattered as much as the final impression he left behind. Was he still there? Was he still recognizable? Did the rhythm continue? If the answer was yes, then the Nile would rise as expected. The seasons would turn, the granaries would open, life would proceed. And if the answer was no, if the image cracked, anxiety crept in, not panic, not revolt, just a quiet sense that something had shifted. The ancient Egyptians were masters of reading small changes. They lived in a landscape where survival depended on noticing subtle variations in water, soil, and sky. It is no surprise that they extended this sensitivity to leadership. The king's body was read like a forecast. This helps us understand why so much care went into representation, why statues were idealized, why reliefs repeated the same poses across centuries, why innovation in royal imagery was rare and cautious. Consistency was not boring, it was safe. And safety in a civilization built on agriculture and long-term planning was the highest achievement. There is a lesson hiding here, almost uncomfortably relevant. Not all power needs to be loud to be effective. Not all authority needs constant reinvention. Sometimes the most stabilizing force is simply showing up again tomorrow, unchanged enough to be trusted. Ancient Egypt understood this deeply. The king did not need to be extraordinary every night. He needed to remain whole, and as long as he did, the world, at least in the minds of those who depended on it, could remain exactly where it was. Quiet, predictable, intact. And that, in a world without modern certainty, was the greatest form of leadership imaginable. Once power was understood as something that had to remain visible and intact, the next concern followed naturally. The bloodline was not allowed to wander. If power in ancient Egypt depended on continuity, then the royal family was the mechanism designed to protect it. Not emotionally, not romantically, mechanically. After understanding that the king's body functioned as a stabilizing symbol, the next quiet realization follows almost naturally. If the body mattered, then the lineage mattered even more. Not because of sentiment, but because lineage was the safest way to make tomorrow resemble today. Change was expensive. Familiarity was efficient. To modern ears, the idea of arranging marriages primarily to avoid uncertainty can sound cold, even calculating. But ancient Egypt was not trying to optimize happiness. It was trying to minimize disruption. In a world where survival depended on predictability, the most dangerous variable was the unknown. So the royal household became a closed system by design. Marriage was not treated as an emotional gamble, it was treated as a risk assessment. The goal was not to expand, it was to preserve, to keep relationships legible, alliances manageable, and succession as frictionless as possible. The fewer unknowns introduced into the system, the smoother it ran. This is why the royal family often behaved less like a family in the modern sense and more like a carefully balanced ecosystem. Every relationship had a function. Every union had implications. Nothing was casual, and very little was spontaneous. And this was not cruelty. It was caution. Imagine a society that had already learned, through centuries of observation, that sudden change rarely improved outcomes, that new elements, however promising, often brought instability before they brought benefits. In such a context, familiarity was not stagnation. It was insurance. Keeping relationships close meant keeping expectations clear. Everyone involved understood the rules. Roles were inherited, not negotiated. Responsibilities were assumed, not debated. This clarity reduced friction, and reduced friction meant fewer cracks in the structure holding everything together. It also meant that personal preference was rarely the deciding factor. This does not mean affection did not exist. It simply means affection was not the organizing principle. Order was. The royal household functioned like a sealed environment, carefully regulating what entered and what stayed out. New blood introduced new loyalties. New loyalties introduced unpredictability, and unpredictability was the enemy of continuity. From this perspective, the strategy makes a certain quiet sense. Modern organizations do something similar, though we rarely frame it so bluntly. Companies promote internally to preserve culture. Institutions favor familiar frameworks over untested ones. Stability is often maintained not by innovation, but by repetition. Ancient Egypt simply applied this logic to its most important institution. The family at the center of the state was not meant to evolve rapidly. It was meant to endure. This approach also simplified succession. When relationships remained within a known network, claims to authority were easier to evaluate. Lineage could be traced without ambiguity. Continuity could be demonstrated visually, genealogically, and symbolically. And symbols mattered. The population did not need to understand the details. They needed to recognize the pattern. The ruler came from the same line, the same house, the same familiar web. Nothing had drifted too far. That recognition provided comfort. There is something almost soothing about a world where leadership looks the same generation after generation. Not exciting, perhaps, but reassuring. The land remains the land. The river flows as expected. The ruler belongs where rulers have always belonged. The system depended on that sense of permanence. This is also where the humor quietly emerges. From the outside, it can look like an extremely limited social circle, an echo chamber of familiarity, a family that never quite expands its guest list. One could imagine the ancient equivalent of awkward gatherings where everyone already knows how the evening will unfold. But predictability was not a flaw. It was the point. Surprises were not celebrated. They were managed. By keeping relationships within a closed framework, the royal household reduced the number of competing interests. External alliances came with expectations. Expectations came with obligations. Obligations introduced pressure. Pressure threatened balance. Better to keep things close. Quiet. Contained. This containment extended beyond marriage into daily life. Children were raised within the same environment. Values were reinforced through repetition. The household became a place where nothing fundamentally new was allowed to grow without careful supervision. It was not a prison. It was a buffer against chaos. And in a civilization that prized order above all else, buffers were invaluable. This helps explain why the royal family often appears insulated from broader society, not isolated but protected, shielded from fluctuations that affected everyone else. While common households adapted constantly to changes in harvests and labor demands, the royal household aimed to remain unchanged. Not static, but steady. The irony is that this intense focus on continuity required constant effort. Maintenance is work. Stability does not happen automatically. It is constructed, reinforced, and guarded. The royal family was not passive in this process. It actively shaped itself to fit the role assigned to it. Personal desires were absorbed into expectations. Individual differences were smoothed out by ritual and routine. The result was a family that functioned as an institution. This institutional nature is why we should be careful not to interpret royal relationships through modern emotional frameworks. Love, in the contemporary sense, was not the organizing principle. Reliability was. The question was never, Does this feel right? The question was, will this keep things from changing? And change was always suspect. Not because it was immoral or forbidden, but because it was unknown. Unknown outcomes meant risk. Risk meant instability. Instability threatened everything. From that perspective, familiarity became a virtue, even if it limited options, even if it required sacrifice. The closed nature of the royal family also reinforced the symbolic completeness discussed earlier. The ruler did not emerge from elsewhere. He did not bring foreign habits into the center. He was the product of a system that reproduced itself carefully, deliberately. This reinforced the idea that authority did not wander. It stayed where it belonged. And as long as it stayed, the world felt manageable. There is a subtle psychological effect at work here. When people believe that leadership follows a known pattern, anxiety decreases, expectations settle, the future feels less threatening. Ancient Egypt understood this intuitively. The royal family was not designed to inspire awe through novelty. It inspired trust through repetition. Even when succession brought a new face, that face belonged to the same pattern, the same framework, the same lineage. Nothing truly new had entered the system. This is why dramatic shifts were rare and unsettling when they occurred. The system was not built for sudden transformation. It was built for gradual handover. From one familiar figure to the next. From one known rhythm to another nearly identical one. The closed nature of the royal household ensured that the rhythm rarely broke. And when it did, history noticed. But most of the time it did not. Most of the time the system worked precisely because it avoided drawing attention to itself. There is a lesson here that modern audiences may find quietly uncomfortable. Progress is not always the highest priority of a civilization. Sometimes survival depends more on sameness than improvement. Sometimes the greatest achievement is preventing disruption rather than creating novelty. Ancient Egypt chose continuity. It invested in it, protected it, built its most important relationships around it. And in doing so, it created a society that could last not just generations, but millennia. Not because it was flexible, but because it was careful. And that care, applied again and again within the closed system of the royal family, kept the bloodline from wandering. And the world, at least for a very long time, stayed exactly where it was meant to be. When lineage was carefully contained, attention shifted inward. Private spaces began to carry public weight. By the time we reach the inner household, the logic of the system should feel familiar. If the king's body stabilized the state and the royal family protected continuity, then the spaces where that family lived could not be casual. They could not be improvised. They could not exist only for comfort. They had work to do. What we often call the harem was not a room, and it certainly was not a fantasy. It was an institution. A complex, layered, carefully managed environment designed to support the most delicate task of all, making sure the future arrived on time. Seen from the outside, it might appear private, hidden, domestic, but in function, it was unmistakably political. This was where daily life intersected with long-term planning. The inner household operated like a quiet machine, Not a loud one, not an aggressive one, but a persistent one. It produced stability, the way a well-run workshop produces goods. Slowly, repeatedly, with attention to detail. Life happened there, of course. People slept, ate, talked, argued, and waited. Children grew up there. Skills were learned, roles were absorbed. But none of this was accidental. The space itself was designed to shape behavior. Education did not begin in classrooms. It began in proximity. Young members of the household learned by watching, by repeating, by absorbing rhythms rather than instructions, how to speak, when to remain silent, how to move through shared spaces without causing disruption. These were not trivial lessons. They were the foundation of functioning within a highly sensitive system. The inner household trained future participants in continuity. And training did not mean ambition was absent. Quiet competition existed everywhere. Not loud rivalries, not public confrontations, but subtle positioning. Attention mattered. Visibility mattered. Proximity mattered. Small advantages accumulated over time, not through dramatic moves, but through consistency. It was not about standing out, it was about not slipping. From a modern perspective, it might resemble a family business that has been running for centuries. Everyone knows the hierarchy. Everyone knows what is expected. Advancement happens slowly, often invisibly, and rarely without trade-offs. The difference is that this business happened to be the state. Production also took place within these walls, not in the sense of mass manufacturing, but in steady, necessary output. Textiles were made, food was prepared, goods were managed and redistributed. The household was not economically passive. It consumed resources, but it also organized them. Records from ancient Egypt show that inner households had administrators, overseers, storage systems, and schedules. Nothing about this environment was idle. Even leisure had structure. Music, conversation, rest, and routine were not distractions from purpose. They were part of maintaining morale and balance within a confined social ecosystem. A tense household was dangerous. Calm was productive. This is where the humor quietly slips in. From the outside, it may look like an environment filled with people who do not work in the modern sense. In reality, it functioned like a workplace, with very high stakes and very few job descriptions. Everyone had a role. Most roles were never written down. Mistakes were not corrected publicly. They were simply remembered. And there was no human resources department. Conflicts were resolved through hierarchy, favor, and time. Not through policy manuals. This created a peculiar dynamic. On one hand, the system encouraged conformity. On the other, it rewarded attentiveness. Those who understood the rhythms of the household, who adapted without drawing attention, tended to survive and even thrive. Those who disrupted the balance rarely lasted. The inner household also acted as a buffer between the ruler and the wider world. Not everything reached the king directly. Information was filtered. Interactions were managed. This insulation was not about deception. It was about focus. The king could not afford constant exposure to instability. The household absorbed and softened fluctuations before they reached the center. In this way, private space performed a public function. The walls did not merely separate, they regulated. Architecturally, this was reflected in design. Separate courtyards, controlled access points, gradations of privacy. Movement through space was not random. It followed patterns that reinforced order and hierarchy. One did not wander freely. one moved with purpose, and over time, these movements shaped behavior. People learned where they belonged, when to advance, when to pause, and when to withdraw. This spatial discipline reduced conflict, or at least kept it quiet. Quiet conflict is easier to manage. The inner household also functioned as a place of observation, not surveillance in the modern sense, but awareness. People noticed patterns, changes in routine, shifts in attention. Nothing dramatic needed to happen for meaning to emerge. A conversation delayed, a presence missing, a gesture repeated. These small signals carried weight. And because everything happened within a closed environment, nothing went unnoticed for long. This constant awareness encouraged caution. Actions were measured, words were chosen carefully. Silence became a tool. The result was an atmosphere where power did not need to be asserted openly. It was understood. This understanding is crucial if we want to avoid projecting modern assumptions onto the past. The inner household was not a place of unchecked indulgence. It was a place of discipline disguised as comfort. People lived well, but they lived attentively. Even relaxation had boundaries. This attentiveness also explains why the inner household could become a site of tension. When many lives are bound to the same limited future, competition is inevitable. But it remained muted. No one benefited from chaos. The system favored those who could wait. Waiting was a skill. Waiting without showing impatience was an even greater one. In many ways, the inner household rewarded emotional restraint. Those who managed their expectations, who aligned personal ambition with the slow rhythm of the institution, found security. Those who rushed found resistance. This is not unique to ancient Egypt. Large organizations often operate the same way. Advancement is rarely about speed. It is about timing. The difference is that here, timing affected dynasties. And so, the private spaces carried national consequences. A successful household meant a smooth transition, a stable upbringing, a ruler prepared, not through instruction, but through immersion. A failed household meant uncertainty, which is why so much effort went into maintaining its balance. This balance did not require perfection. It required durability. The inner household was allowed to be imperfect, as long as it remained functional. And functionality meant one thing above all else. The future must remain manageable. From this perspective, the inner household becomes less mysterious and more familiar. It was not exotic. It was organizational. It was a system designed to quietly convert daily life into long-term stability. And it did so remarkably well. Not through spectacle, not through excess, but through routine, repetition, and carefully managed proximity. In other words, it worked the way most enduring systems work. By doing the same things in the same way, long enough that they stopped drawing attention. And as long as they stopped drawing attention, the state could continue, quietly, predictably, intact. When private spaces began to matter at a national level, the people shaping those spaces could no longer remain invisible. Women were not standing outside of history. Up to this point, the system may sound carefully engineered, but oddly impersonal. Bodies as symbols, families as mechanisms, private spaces as quiet machines. It would be easy to assume that individuals, especially women inside the royal household, were simply carried along by forces larger than themselves. That assumption would be a mistake. If the inner household functioned as a system, then women were not passive components within it. They were active participants, often operating with a level of awareness and strategic understanding that modern retellings tend to overlook, not because they were loud, but because they were embedded. Power in ancient Egypt did not always announce itself. Much of it worked sideways, through proximity, continuity, and timing. And women, particularly those closest to the center of the household, understood this better than anyone. Their influence was rarely expressed as confrontation. It was expressed as placement. To understand this, we have to let go of modern ideas about power being exercised primarily through public office or formal command. In ancient Egypt, power often flowed through domestic structure, through who managed resources, who controlled access, who shaped daily routines, and women did all three. Queens and high-ranking women within the household possessed property in their own names. This is not speculation. Administrative records, inscriptions, and legal documents show women owning land, managing estates, employing staff, and overseeing production. These were not symbolic holdings. They were functional assets. Economic independence created leverage. A woman who controlled resources could influence outcomes quietly. She could support allies, secure loyalty, provide stability for her children. None of this required public declarations. It required patience and foresight. This is why we should be cautious about imagining the inner household as a place where women waited passively for attention. Waiting existed, yes, but it was rarely empty. Waiting was used. A woman's position within the household was shaped by her relationships, but also by her competence. The ability to manage a household wing, oversee servants, organize production, or maintain calm during periods of uncertainty mattered enormously. These skills were not accidental. They were learned, practiced, and refined over years. In many ways, women functioned as managers of continuity. They ensured that daily life did not fracture under pressure. They maintained routines. They absorbed tension. They mediated disputes. All of this contributed to the stability of the system discussed earlier. And stability was power. This form of power did not rely on spectacle. It relied on reliability. There is a subtle irony here. Because these roles were considered domestic, they were often underestimated by later observers. But domestic space was where the future was shaped, where children grew, where habits formed, where expectations became normal. Influence exerted there had long-lasting effects. This is why queens often appear alongside kings in monumental art, not as decoration but as partners in maintaining order. Their presence signaled legitimacy. Their continuity reassured the population. Their visibility mattered, but visibility was only one layer. Behind the scenes, women navigated complex networks of relationships. They balanced loyalty to their natal families with obligations to the royal household. They supported their children without openly destabilizing the system. They understood when to act and when to remain still. This required a kind of intelligence that does not always register in traditional narratives. It was not about ambition in the modern sense. It was about positioning within a structure that rewarded restraint. A woman who pushed too hard risked backlash. One who moved too subtly risked being overlooked. The balance was delicate, and many mastered it. This is where the humor gently returns. From the outside, it may look like a place where nothing happens quickly. In reality, everything is happening slowly all the time. Decisions are not made in moments of drama. They are made through accumulation. A word spoken at the right time. A silence maintained when others speak. A favor remembered. This is not unique to ancient Egypt. Anyone who has navigated long-standing institutions will recognize the pattern. The difference is that here, the institution was the state. Women also played crucial roles in religious and ceremonial contexts. But even without emphasizing those aspects, their participation reinforced their centrality. They were visible where continuity was publicly affirmed. Their presence made the abstract tangible. When a queen appeared beside the ruler, she represented more than companionship. She represented lineage, legitimacy, and the promise of succession. This promise mattered deeply. The future of the state depended not just on having an heir, but on having an heir raised within the correct environment. Women shaped that environment. They influenced education, behavior, and expectations from the earliest years. A child raised within a stable, well-managed household absorbed order as instinct. That instinct carried forward. This is why women's influence extended beyond their own lifetimes. The habits they reinforced persisted. The values they normalized became standard. Power that reproduces itself quietly is the most durable kind. It is also the least visible, which explains why later histories, focused on battles and monuments, often miss it. The inner household rewarded emotional intelligence, the ability to read situations, to anticipate shifts, to adjust without drawing attention. Women who possessed these skills thrived. Those who did not often disappeared from records, not because they were unimportant, but because they did not shape outcomes. There is a temptation to frame this discussion in terms of empowerment versus oppression. That framework is too blunt for what we are observing. This was not a world where women either ruled or were silenced. It was a world where influence operated through structure. And within that structure, women had room to maneuver. Not unlimited room, not equal room, but real room. They used it to secure futures for their children, to protect their households, to maintain stability during transitions. In moments of succession, this influence became especially clear. Women acted as anchors, as points of continuity between generations. Their support could legitimize a new ruler. Their absence could raise questions. This did not require formal authority. It required trust. And trust, once established, is powerful. This brings us back to the central theme that has been building quietly through each section. Ancient Egypt survived not because it constantly reinvented itself, but because it invested deeply in continuity. Women were essential to that investment. They were not standing outside of history, waiting to be noticed. They were standing inside it, holding it together, not through force, not through spectacle, but through care, strategy, and an acute understanding of how systems endure. And perhaps the most remarkable thing is how little of this needed to be said out loud, because the women who operated within this structure understood something fundamental. In a world built on rhythm, the most powerful movements are the ones that never disrupt the beat. They simply keep it going, quietly, reliably, long enough that history itself begins to lean on them. And from there we move gently into the next layer of the night. Part 5. The anxiety that never slept. By now a pattern has quietly taken shape. Power rested in presence. Families were structured to avoid surprise. Private spaces carried public responsibility. Women worked within the system to keep it balanced. And yet, beneath all of this careful design, there was something that never fully settled. A low, constant anxiety. Not the fear of invasion, not the fear of rebellion, not even the fear of loss. The deepest fear was interruption. The possibility that one day something would fail to continue. Ancient Egypt did not wake each morning worrying about enemies at the gate. It worried about mornings that might not arrive as expected, about rhythms that might slip, about cycles that might hesitate. Because when a civilization builds itself around repetition, the greatest threat is not destruction, it is delay. This anxiety was rarely spoken aloud. It did not need to be. It lived in routines, in preparations, in precautions layered upon precautions. It appeared in how carefully succession was managed, in how closely health was monitored, in how much attention was paid to small signs. A cough, an absence, a pause that lasted a moment too long. None of these were disasters on their own, but they hinted at something far more unsettling. What if tomorrow did not resemble today? This fear did not produce panic. Panic would have broken the rhythm. Instead, it produced vigilance. A quiet, almost gentle vigilance that never fully relaxed. Think of it like a thought that returns when you try to sleep. You are not alarmed. You are not distressed, but you notice it again and again. Everything is fine, but what if it isn't? This is the emotional atmosphere that shaped ancient Egyptian governance far more than dramatic crises ever did. The concern was not that the system would collapse suddenly. It was that it might slowly lose momentum, that the careful handover from one generation to the next might stumble, that the chain might not break loudly, but simply fail to connect. This is why the idea of succession carried such weight. Not because power was exciting, but because uncertainty was exhausting. A clear successor meant sleep. An unclear one meant waiting. Waiting with unease. The population did not need to understand the details of succession politics. They needed reassurance that someone would be there tomorrow, that the rhythm would continue, that the figure at the center of the system would not vanish without replacement. Absence was more frightening than defeat. A defeated king could be replaced. An absent king left a vacuum. And vacuums invite questions. This anxiety shaped how people watched the royal household, not with suspicion but with attentiveness. Signs of continuity were noted. Signs of hesitation were felt. A new child born into the household did not spark celebration alone. It sparked relief. Relief that the future had not stalled. Relief that the system had one more option, one more thread. The irony is that the more carefully the system worked, the more it became aware of how fragile continuity actually was. Everything depended on people remaining present, healthy, and capable long enough for transitions to occur smoothly. And people, unlike symbols, are not perfectly predictable. This is where humor very gently enters the picture. For a civilization obsessed with order, it relied heavily on the reliability of human bodies. Bodies that aged, that tired, that occasionally failed to cooperate with expectations. The entire structure rested on the assumption that someone would always be ready in time. Most of the time, this worked, but the possibility that it might not never fully disappeared. This anxiety also explains the extraordinary attention given to preparation. Redundancy was not wasteful, it was comforting. Multiple potential successors were not a sign of indecision, they were insurance. Better to have too many options than too few. Better to worry quietly now than to panic later. And so the system layered reassurance upon reassurance. Daily rituals reinforced normality. Ceremonies reaffirmed continuity. Appearances were managed carefully. All of this served one purpose: to make tomorrow feel inevitable. The fear of interruption also shaped how time itself was perceived. Ancient Egypt did not view history as a straight line racing forward. It viewed it as a loop, a cycle, a return. But loops only work if they close. If something interrupts the return, the loop breaks. That break was the nightmare. Not dramatic destruction, but unresolved transition. This is why the idea of not continuing carried such weight. It was not framed as catastrophe. It was framed as failure. Failure to pass on. Failure to repeat. Failure to maintain the beat. This fear was not paralyzing. It was motivating. It drove preparation. It encouraged caution. It rewarded patience. Those who moved too quickly threatened the rhythm. Those who waited understood it. And so anxiety became a quiet companion to power. Always present, rarely acknowledged, never fully dismissed. Even in moments of apparent calm, the system listened for silence that lasted too long. In this sense, ancient Egypt resembles something very familiar. Anyone who has maintained a long-standing routine knows this feeling. The routine becomes comforting, but the thought of it breaking becomes unsettling. You do not obsess over it, but it lingers. What if one day it simply doesn't happen? That thought does not scream. It whispers, and whispers are harder to silence. The remarkable thing is how effectively ancient Egypt lived with this anxiety. It did not attempt to eliminate it. It built structures around it, systems that acknowledged uncertainty without being overwhelmed by it. The result was a civilization that endured, not because it was fearless, but because it was careful. Care is born from awareness. And awareness in this case was sharpened by the constant, low-level fear that everything depended on continuation. This fear did not make the society brittle. It made it attentive. Attentive to signs, attentive to transitions, attentive to the spaces between moments. This attentiveness allowed Egypt to absorb shocks without losing its shape. Not forever, nothing lasts forever, but long enough to leave an impression that still feels solid thousands of years later. So when we think about what ancient Egypt feared most, it is tempting to imagine armies, invasions, disasters. Those were real, but they were not constant. Interruption was the fear that one day, quietly, without drama, the system might hesitate and fail to resume, that the familiar face would not appear, that the expected handover would not happen, that the rhythm would miss a beat. This is why so much effort went into ensuring that nothing ever seemed to stop, because stopping was not just an inconvenience. It was the end of reassurance. And reassurance, more than conquest or glory, was what kept the world turning. Night after night, generation after generation. As long as the thought of interruption could be pushed just far enough into the background to allow sleep to come, until morning arrived, and everything, once again, continued. When anxiety became constant, clarity had to be maintained without noise. That is when images replaced words. If anxiety was the quiet hum beneath ancient Egyptian life, then symbols were the language used to keep that hum from becoming noise. After all the structures we've traced so far, the body, the family, the household, the constant fear of interruption, one solution begins to stand out clearly. Do not explain, do not debate, do not persuade, show. Ancient Egypt was not a civilization that trusted words to do heavy work. Words could be misunderstood, spoken explanations could drift, arguments invited disagreement. But images were stable, images stayed where they were placed, images repeated themselves without variation. And repetition, as we have seen, was safety. This is why symbols carried such weight. They did not decorate power. They replaced explanation altogether. A carved figure did not argue for legitimacy. It assumed it. A relief did not describe continuity. It performed it visually. Anyone who looked at it, regardless of education or language, understood the message immediately. Everything is intact. Everything is complete. Nothing has changed. That was enough. In a society deeply invested in reassurance, symbols did what speeches never could. They removed doubt by eliminating interpretation. You did not ask what a symbol meant, you recognized it. This is why Egyptian visual culture appears so consistent across centuries. To modern eyes, it can feel repetitive. Kings standing in similar poses, faces frozen in calm composure, scenes arranged with familiar proportions. But this repetition was not artistic laziness. It was discipline. Innovation in imagery was risky. A new pose suggested a new meaning. A new meaning invited questions. Questions disrupted calm. Better to carve what everyone already understood. This approach also explains the extraordinary investment in objects. Clothing, furniture, tools, and decorative items were not merely functional. They communicated completeness. A well-equipped space signaled preparedness. A carefully arranged room signaled order. A familiar object signaled continuity. None of this required explanation. The viewer absorbed the message without effort. And effortlessness was important. If reassurance required interpretation, it could fail. If it arrived instantly, it worked. This is where the humor slides gently into view. Today, leaders publish reports, statistics, and achievements. They announce progress with charts and presentations. In ancient Egypt, the equivalent was far simpler. You carved success into stone. Once carved, it did not need updating. Stone does not issue corrections. The presence of certain objects communicated status, stability, and capability. Thrones, staffs, ceremonial items, clothing, and architectural features all carried meaning that did not need translation. They were not symbols because someone said they were. They were symbols because everyone agreed to treat them that way. An agreement is powerful. Even everyday items participated in this visual language. Storage vessels, tools, textiles, and furnishings were arranged to reflect abundance and order. Scarcity was hidden. Disruption was smoothed over. The goal was not deception. It was reassurance. To show that the system had enough food, enough people, enough structure, enough to continue. This visual language extended into public spaces as well as private ones. Walls spoke quietly, courtyards repeated familiar patterns, columns stood where columns had always stood. Movement through space reinforced expectations. You knew where you were. You knew what role you occupied. You knew what came next. This predictability reduced anxiety. Symbols worked because they aligned with lived experience. They did not contradict reality. They emphasized the parts of reality that supported stability. This is an important distinction. Ancient Egyptian imagery did not invent a fantasy world. It selected what to highlight. It highlighted completeness over struggle, continuity over change, order over exception. And because these values were reinforced everywhere, they became normal. Over time, the distinction between symbol and reality blurred. The image did not represent order. It helped create it. This is especially clear when we look at how rulers were depicted. Youthful, upright, balanced, not exaggerated but idealized. Not because they were expected to be superhuman, but because they were expected to be sufficient. Sufficiency was the visual goal. A ruler who looked whole communicated that the system was working. And because these images were repeated endlessly, the idea of sufficiency became inseparable from leadership itself. You did not ask whether the ruler was adequate. The image answered for you. This visual reassurance also extended into absence. When the ruler was not physically present, his image was. Statues stood in his place. Reliefs filled the gaps. Symbols substituted for proximity. This allowed continuity even when bodies were elsewhere. Again, no explanation required. The image was enough. This helps explain why Egyptian art rarely captured moments of crisis. Not because crises did not exist, but because displaying them served no purpose. Anxiety was already present. There was no need to amplify it. Art did not document disruption, it neutralized it. By showing stability repeatedly, it trained the population to expect it. The effect was subtle, but profound. When people expect continuity, they behave in ways that support it. They wait, they comply, they adapt quietly. Symbols shape behavior by shaping expectation. And expectation is powerful. Even humor, when allowed, stayed within symbolic boundaries. Lightness appeared in repetition rather than surprise. Familiar scenes invited recognition rather than shock. Recognition was comforting. This entire system depended on shared understanding. Symbols only work if people agree on their meaning. Ancient Egypt invested centuries in building that agreement. Once established, it required little maintenance. A carved wall could speak for generations without changing its message. That is efficiency. There is something deeply calming about this approach. No need for constant updates. No urgent explanations, no competing narratives. Just the same images doing the same work, quietly. It is tempting to think of this as rigid. But rigidity is not the same as strength. This system was flexible where it mattered. Behind the scenes, adjustments happened constantly, but the surface remained calm. Symbols protected the surface, and the surface protected sleep. This brings us back to the anxiety discussed earlier. When fear of interruption lurked beneath everything, symbols acted like soft blankets laid over uncertainty. They did not remove the fear, they covered it. Just enough so that life could proceed, so that tomorrow could feel familiar, so that people could look at stone, wood, cloth, and space and feel reassured without needing to think. In that sense, ancient Egypt mastered something modern societies still struggle with. They understood that reassurance does not need to be loud. It needs to be consistent. And consistency, once established, can speak more clearly than words ever could. Which is why today, thousands of years later, we still understand the message. Not because it was explained, but because it was shown again and again, quietly, endlessly, as if continuity itself had been carved into the world and left there to do its work while everyone else rested. And now, we gently invite you to continue with us into the next chapter. When health became policy. After symbols did their quiet work, after images reassured where words might have unsettled, attention inevitably returned to the most fragile element in the entire system, the human body itself, not in a dramatic sense, not as something heroic or tragic, but as something that needed to keep functioning. Because continuity, as we have seen, depended less on brilliance than on endurance. Health in ancient Egypt was not treated as a private matter. It could not be. When so much stability rested on presence, absence became dangerous. Weakness became noticeable. Illness became political, even if no one called it that out loud. The goal was not perfection. It was normality. Normal days, normal movement, normal appearance. As long as those continued, the system could breathe. Ancient Egyptian medicine reflected this mindset clearly. It was not obsessed with miracle cures or dramatic interventions. It focused on observation, repetition, and adjustment. Watching what worked, trying what seemed reasonable, combining experience with everyday belief, without separating the two too sharply. This was not science as we define it today. But it was not superstition either. It was practical care shaped by long familiarity with the body. Physicians did not operate in isolation. They were part of a broader environment that included caregivers, attendants, and household staff. Health was maintained through routine as much as treatment, cleanliness, regular schedules, rest, food prepared in predictable ways. None of this sounds remarkable. That is precisely the point. Remarkable interventions draw attention. Attention invites anxiety. Quiet maintenance keeps things moving. Medical texts from ancient Egypt reveal a careful, methodical approach. Symptoms were noted, patterns were recorded, treatments were adjusted when they failed. There was no shame in trying something else. This flexibility mattered. Bodies change, seasons change. What works today might not work tomorrow. The goal was not to dominate illness, it was to manage it. This attitude extended to those at the center of power. The ruler's health received attention not because he was indulgent, but because his condition affected everyone else. A ruler who appeared tired or absent disrupted reassurance. So care was taken to prevent visible decline. Not hide it completely. That would have been impossible. But soften it, delay it, reduce its impact. The focus was on sustaining appearance, movement, and routine. A healthy-looking ruler calmed the population more effectively than any proclamation. This emphasis on appearance does not mean deception, it means prioritization. What mattered most was not how the body felt internally, but how it functioned publicly. This might sound harsh, but it reflects a broader truth about societies built on continuity. The system does not require heroism. It requires reliability. Health practices were therefore conservative. Extreme measures were avoided unless necessary. Familiar remedies were preferred over untested ones. The known was safer than the unknown. This caution also explains why medical care blended practical observation with belief systems rooted in everyday life. The distinction between the physical and the symbolic was not rigid. Both addressed uncertainty. Both reassured. A remedy did not need to cure completely to be useful. It needed to restore balance enough for routine to resume. That was success. This is where the humor quietly reappears. From a modern perspective, we might expect dramatic treatments or bold experimentation. Instead, ancient Egyptian medicine often resembles something closer to attentive caretaking. Eat regularly. Rest when needed. Avoid excess. Repeat what seems to help. It is almost disappointing in its simplicity. But simplicity was reliable. The body was treated as something that could be guided back toward normality through steady care rather than force. This approach reduced shock, reduced risk, reduced visible disruption, and visible disruption was the enemy. Even when illness could not be fully resolved, it was managed, accommodated, integrated into routine. As long as the ruler could appear, move, and perform expected actions, the system remained intact. This does not mean suffering was ignored. It means suffering was contained. Contained suffering does not destabilize systems. Public collapse does. This philosophy extended beyond rulers. The broader population benefited from similar approaches. Healthcare was not exclusive to elites. Records show that ordinary people received treatment, advice, and care. This widespread attention to health reinforced a culture of maintenance. People learned to observe their bodies, to notice changes, to respond early, to rely on familiarity rather than panic. In this way, health practices supported the same values that defined governance: predictability, repetition, continuity. The medical environment also respected limits. There was an understanding that not everything could be fixed. Aging happened. Decline eventually came. The goal was not to defeat time, it was to negotiate with it. Delay mattered, even small delays mattered. because delays allowed transitions to occur on schedule. This mindset helps explain why ancient Egypt did not fetishize youth in the way modern societies often do. Youth was useful, experience was stabilizing. A balanced presence mattered more than vigor alone. A ruler did not need to be energetic. He needed to be present. Presence could be supported through careful health management. This management required coordination. Physicians, attendants, and household staff worked together. Information was shared quietly. Adjustments were made without announcement. No dramatic interventions, no public concern, just continued care. This approach also protected dignity. Illness did not need to define identity. It was treated as a condition, not a failure. And this mattered psychologically. When health issues did arise, they were addressed within the framework of normality, not as catastrophes, not as moral judgments. This reduced fear. Fear weakens bodies as much as disease. Ancient Egyptian medicine understood this intuitively. Calm was therapeutic. Routine was healing. Predictability restored confidence. The entire system functioned as a feedback loop. Stable governance reduced anxiety. Reduced anxiety supported health. Supported health reinforced stability. This loop did not eliminate illness, it made illness less disruptive. And disruption, as we've seen repeatedly, was the true threat. This perspective also sheds light on why ancient Egyptian medical texts often emphasize observation over theory. They describe what was seen, what was tried, and what happened next. There is humility in this approach. Not everything is known, not everything can be controlled, but much can be managed. Management, not mastery, was the goal. This humility extended to the understanding that care itself was political, even if it was never labeled that way. Keeping bodies functioning kept systems functioning. And systems functioning allowed life to continue with minimal disturbance. Which brings us back to the quiet heart of this civilization. Ancient Egypt did not survive because it conquered relentlessly or innovated constantly. It survived because it paid close attention to the ordinary things that allowed tomorrow to resemble today. Health was one of those things. Maintained patiently, adjusted cautiously, integrated into routine, no grand speeches, no dramatic cures, just the steady work of keeping bodies capable enough to hold their place in the rhythm. And as long as that rhythm continued, the world felt manageable. Night after night, day after day. Enough to allow sleep. Enough to let continuity do its quiet work. Enough to keep history moving forward without ever needing to announce itself. And as the body became something the state quietly watched, some lives began to carry meanings larger than themselves, when individuals became symbols. By this point, it should feel clear that ancient Egypt was not primarily interested in personalities. It did not celebrate uniqueness the way modern cultures often do. It favored patterns, roles, repetition, and yet people still lived inside this system. Bodies aged. Strength varied. Time left its marks unevenly. And when individuals did stand out, it was rarely because they broke the structure. It was because the structure absorbed them and turned them into symbols. This is where history becomes quieter, not louder. Because the figures that remain visible to us today are not remembered as complicated human beings, but as condensed meanings, long reign, short life, abundance, fragility, endurance, vulnerability. Not stories with dramatic arcs, but shapes that fit neatly into the rhythm the civilization already understood. Some rulers lived a very long time. This longevity did not necessarily mean brilliance or exceptional talent. It meant that the system had time to work, time to settle, time to repeat itself without interruption. A long-lived ruler became a symbol of ease, of continuity so smooth that it barely needed attention. When nothing changes for decades, people stop worrying about change. A long reign allowed memory to soften. Crises faded. Adjustments disappeared into routine. What remained was the impression that the world was stable because the ruler was stable. The individual, over time, dissolved into reassurance. These rulers were not remembered for what they did each year, but for the fact that they kept being there. Their presence became background, familiar, almost invisible. And invisibility, in this context, was success. Then there were those who did not last. Short reigns, fragile bodies, interrupted lives. These figures did not fit the ideal image, but they did not disrupt the system either. Instead, they became symbols of something else: limitation. They reminded the civilization of a truth it never forgot but rarely discussed openly, that the system depended on human bodies, and human bodies were not perfectly reliable. This awareness did not lead to condemnation. It led to adjustment. A weak ruler was not necessarily seen as a failure. He was seen as a signal, a reminder that preparation mattered, that contingency mattered, that the future required backup plans. Fragility was absorbed into meaning. Rather than becoming an embarrassment, it became a lesson in vulnerability, quietly acknowledged. Some rulers came to represent abundance, not because they personally created it, but because their reign coincided with periods where the rhythm worked especially well. Good harvests, smooth transitions, familiar patterns repeating without resistance. Over time, these rulers were remembered as sources of plenty, even if their direct actions were unremarkable. The association was enough. Abundance attached itself to the person. The individual became shorthand. Mention the name and the idea followed, not because history was careless, but because it was efficient. This compression of meaning allowed memory to function smoothly. Instead of holding thousands of details, the culture held symbols. Long reign meant stability. Many children meant continuation. Calm years meant prosperity. And the opposite held true as well. Some figures became symbols of fragility, not shamefully, quietly. Their stories did not scream disaster. They whispered caution, a short life, a body that struggled, a reign that passed quickly. These figures reminded the civilization that continuity was not automatic. It had to be supported, protected, rehearsed. They did not inspire fear. They inspired carefulness. This is why ancient Egyptian historical memory often feels emotionally restrained. There is little outrage, little judgment, little dramatic moral framing. People did not fail. Circumstances happened, and circumstances were folded back into the system. This observational tone is important. Ancient Egypt did not frame history as a series of triumphs and mistakes. It framed it as a sequence of conditions. Some conditions allowed stability to flourish. Others tested it. Either way, the system learned. This learning did not require blame. It required attention. Even the most famous figures, when examined closely, fit this pattern. They are remembered less as personalities and more as embodiments of particular states. One ruler becomes endurance, another becomes transition, another becomes excess, another becomes restraint. The human complexity beneath these labels is real, but it was not the focus. What mattered was what their presence allowed the system to do. This approach to memory also explains why individual suffering is rarely foregrounded. Pain existed, loss existed, but history did not linger on it. Lingering would disrupt calm. Instead, suffering was acknowledged indirectly through symbols of fragility, brevity, and transition. The result is a historical record that feels distant, but also strangely gentle. No one is dragged through judgment. No one is glorified excessively. Everyone is absorbed. This absorption allowed the civilization to keep moving forward without being trapped by any single life. And yet, humor still finds its way in. From a modern perspective, it can seem almost unfair. Imagine being remembered not for your thoughts, struggles, or decisions, but for a single condition. You lived long. You did not. You were plentiful. You were fragile. That is it. Centuries reduced to one quiet adjective. But this reduction was not cruel. It was functional. The system did not have space for complexity at the level of memory. It needed clarity. It needed examples that reinforced understanding. And clarity came from simplification. This is why individual lives did not disrupt the rhythm even when they were unusual. The rhythm absorbed them. A weak ruler did not collapse the system. The system adjusted around him. A long-lived ruler did not dominate memory with personality. He faded into the background of normality. In both cases, the individual served continuity rather than challenging it. This is a very different relationship between person and power than we see today. Modern cultures often elevate individuals as engines of change. Ancient Egypt treated individuals as variables within a larger pattern. Important variables, yes, but variables nonetheless. The tone remained observational. This ruler lived long. This one did not. This period felt full. This one felt delicate. No outrage, no celebration, just notation. This does not mean ancient Egyptians lacked emotion. It means they directed emotion towards stability rather than personality. The emotional investment was in continuation, not in individual destiny. Which brings us back to the broader atmosphere of sleep that runs through this narrative. There is something deeply calming about a world that does not demand constant judgment, that allows events to pass without attaching moral panic to them. A ruler's weakness did not mean the world was broken. It meant the world needed care. A ruler's abundance did not mean genius. It meant alignment. Alignment was everything. When alignment occurred, individuals seemed larger than life. When it did not, individuals seemed small. But in both cases, the system remained the focus. This perspective also protected people from despair. When loss occurred, it was not framed as the end. It was framed as a transition. When strength faded, it was not shameful. It was expected. Time moved on. Someone else stepped forward. The rhythm resumed. And that rhythm, more than any individual story, was what ancient Egypt preserved so carefully. So when we look back at these figures today, we should resist the temptation to dramatize them too much. They were not heroes or warnings in the modern sense. They were markers. Markers along a very long path of continuity, each one indicating a condition the system passed through, some smooth, some uneven, all absorbed. And perhaps that is the quietest lesson of all. In a civilization that lasted as long as ancient Egypt, no single life could carry the full weight of meaning. Meaning had to be distributed, shared, compressed into symbols that could be carried forward without strain. So individuals became symbols, not because they wanted to, but because the civilization needed them to be. And once transformed, they rested there, in stone, in memory, in silence, allowing the rhythm to continue, unburdened by excess emotion, as night followed day and day followed night, long enough that history itself began to feel like a kind of sleep. And eventually, when meaning became concentrated in people, closeness itself began to carry risk. Privacy became dangerous. Up to this point, everything has felt remarkably contained. The system absorbed people. Symbols replaced individuals. Continuity softened shock. But any closed system, no matter how carefully designed, carries pressure. And pressure does not need malice to become dangerous. It only needs proximity. This is the moment where private life, which had quietly carried national weight, began to develop sharp edges. Not because people suddenly became cruel, but because everyone inside the structure was trying to survive. This is where stillness starts to hum, where quiet rooms carry tension, where closeness becomes risk. A royal household in ancient Egypt was never small. It was layered, populated, interconnected, multiple partners, many children, extended kin, servants, officials, tutors, caretakers, all living within a system that promised stability, but could only offer it to one future ruler. Everyone else remained possible. And possibility is not neutral. Succession was never just a future event. It was a constant presence, a background noise that never fully disappeared. Even during peaceful years, the question hovered: who comes next? This question did not need to be spoken aloud to shape behavior. It influenced where people stood, who was seen, who was taught, who was remembered, and who was quietly set aside. Importantly, this pressure did not come from villainy. It came from structure. When only one outcome can be realized, every alternative becomes a liability. This does not require hatred. It requires calculation. People inside the system were not scheming because they were evil. They were adapting because the structure rewarded preparedness. A mother who promoted her child was not betraying others. She was ensuring survival. A tutor who aligned with one branch of the family was not corrupt. He was practical. A household that gathered allies was not rebellious. It was cautious. This is what happens when intimacy overlaps with governance. Private affection becomes strategic. Silence becomes meaningful. Small gestures matter, and the danger is not explosive. It is quiet. Most of the time, nothing happened. Years passed, routines held, but beneath the calm surface, awareness accumulated. Everyone knew the system could only choose one. This is why ancient Egyptian history includes moments where the palace itself becomes the source of instability, not because of sudden betrayal, but because tension had nowhere else to go. Closed systems amplify internal movement. The closer people are, the more every shift matters. This is where private space becomes sensitive space. Bedrooms are no longer just personal. Nurseries are no longer innocent. Education becomes signaling. Health becomes information. Even absence becomes data. If someone is seen less, people notice. If someone is favored more, people adjust. The household becomes a landscape of attention, and attention is never evenly distributed. What is striking when examined closely is how rarely these pressures exploded into open chaos. For the most part, the system worked. Most transitions were managed. This is important. Ancient Egypt did not constantly collapse under palace intrigue. That image is exaggerated. But when disruption did occur, it followed a recognizable pattern. It began quietly. With alliances, with whispers, with delayed reactions, and usually with the realization that the future was narrowing. The most famous example often cited by historians is the conspiracy within a royal household aimed at altering succession. What makes this notable is not its drama, but its familiarity. It looks exactly like what you would expect when a closed system tightens too much. A group forms, motives overlap, fear combines with hope. And private grievances find public consequences. Yet even here, moral judgment is minimal in the historical record. Participants are not painted as monsters. They are recorded as actors, people responding to circumstances. The system did not moralize their fear. It neutralized it. Once discovered, the response was procedural, contained. The priority was not outrage. It was restoration of order. This again reflects the broader cultural focus. The danger was not betrayal. The danger was interruption. Anything that threatened continuity had to be removed, not punished emotionally. This is why punishments, when they appear, are often described without flourish. No speeches, no moral lessons, just resolution. The goal was not justice in a modern sense. The goal was closure. Because closure allowed the rhythm to resume. From a modern perspective, this restraint can feel unsettling. We expect stories of conspiracy to carry drama. We expect villains. But ancient Egypt was less interested in storytelling than in maintenance. What mattered was that the disruption ended. The cause mattered less. This perspective also explains why family size increased tension rather than reducing it. More children did not mean more security. It meant more variables, more possibilities, more uncertainty, which is why the earlier emphasis on structure mattered so much. Education systems, titles, hierarchy. These were not just traditions, they were pressure valves. They reduced unpredictability, they narrowed options without open conflict. But no system is perfect. And when pressure exceeded capacity, private life became dangerous. Not because people suddenly lost morality, but because morality was never the primary stabilizer. Continuity was. This creates a strange emotional tone. On one hand, the household is intimate. On the other, it is strategic. Affection exists, but it cannot fully protect. Care exists, but it must navigate hierarchy. This duality is exhausting, and yet it was normalized. People grew up inside it. They learned when to speak, when to remain still, when to wait. This cultivated a culture of observation. People watched more than they acted. This is why historical records feel restrained. Much happened without being written, because much was never meant to surface. The danger of privacy was not that secrets existed. It was that secrets had weight. And weight accumulates. Eventually, something tips. When it does, the response is swift, not emotional, administrative. Restore balance. Move forward. Do not dwell. And then remarkably, silence returns. This is the part that feels most foreign to modern audiences. We expect fallout, trauma narratives, enduring scandal. But ancient Egypt did not preserve scandal. It erased it. Not to hide wrongdoing, but to prevent repetition. Memory was curated for calm, which brings us to the quiet humor embedded in all of this. From a distance, it almost resembles a very large family gathering where everyone is polite, attentive, and deeply aware that inheritance exists. Smiles are sincere. Compliments are careful. No one raises their voice, but everyone is counting chairs, not because they are greedy, because they understand reality. In such a family, peace is maintained not by love alone, but by structure. And when structure falters, love cannot compensate. This is not cynicism. It is realism. Ancient Egyptian society was deeply aware of human nature. It did not expect purity. It expected predictability. So, when privacy became dangerous, it was not treated as a moral failure. It was treated as a mechanical issue. Something to be corrected, contained, and then allowed to fade. Which is why, when we step back, the overwhelming impression is not chaos. It is control. Fragile control. Maintained control. Control that required constant attention, but not constant alarm. This approach allowed the civilization to endure internal tension without dissolving, most of the time. And that most of the time is doing a great deal of work here, because perfection was never the goal. Continuation was. This section ends where the night begins to thin. After tension, there is release. After danger, there is quiet. The system resets. People return to routine. And the private spaces that briefly carried risk return to silence. The rhythm resumes, as it always aimed to do. And in that resumption, the civilization finds its greatest strength, not in preventing danger, but in surviving it without spectacle. Which leads us gently toward the final reflection. Because after danger passes, the question is no longer about conflict. It is about why the system insisted on calm in the first place, and what it gains by ending each night without raising its voice. And after privacy became risky, something quieter took over, what was never said out loud. After pressure, after proximity, after the quiet danger of private lives colliding with power, ancient Egyptian society did not respond with louder rules or sharper punishments. It responded with limits that were rarely announced. This is where the system becomes most subtle. Not everything was permitted, not everything was acceptable, but very little was argued openly. What mattered was not drawing attention to disruption. This is the part that modern listeners often miss. Ancient Egypt did not function through constant moral debate. It functioned through containment, through boundaries that were understood without being repeated, through expectations that lived in silence rather than law codes. And silence here was not avoidance. It was strategy. After everything we have already seen, the closed household, the pressure of succession, the danger of intimacy, the culture arrives at a quiet conclusion. Order is fragile, therefore noise must be limited. This does not mean the society lacked ethics. It means ethics were practical. The question was rarely, is this right or wrong? The question was, does this disturb balance? If the answer was yes, the behavior was discouraged. If the answer was no, it was often ignored. This framework explains why many things that might surprise modern audiences do not appear prominently in texts, not because they did not exist, but because they were not useful to preserve. Ancient Egyptian morality was deeply tied to order, continuity, and predictability. Anything that threatened these values attracted attention. Anything that did not was allowed to fade. Silence was not moral cowardice. It was maintenance. Arguments create ripples. Ripples spread. Spread leads to instability. So silence was preferred. This preference shaped daily life in subtle ways. People learned what not to discuss publicly, what to keep within walls, what to resolve quietly. Disputes were managed, not dramatized. Transgressions were corrected, not debated. The goal was not ideological purity. The goal was calm. This is why we see such restraint in surviving texts. Declarations of innocence focus less on abstract sin and more on social disruption. Not, I have never desired wrongly, but I have not violated another household. I have not disrupted order. I have not caused harm. The emphasis is relational, not internal. What matters is impact, not intent. This moral structure makes ancient Egyptian society feel emotionally distant, but structurally intelligent. It understood something very basic. People will always do things you cannot fully control. What you can control is whether those actions destabilize the whole. And so not everything was addressed. Not everything was punished. Many things were simply not spoken. Silence functioned as a buffer. It allowed society to move past issues without reopening them repeatedly. It reduced the emotional charge of conflict. It prevented escalation. From a modern perspective, this might look like repression. But in context, it was conservation. Energy was not wasted on arguments that could not produce stability. This is especially visible in intimate life. Private behavior was rarely policed unless it crossed into public consequence. What happened behind doors mattered less than whether doors stayed closed. Visibility was the line. Once something became visible enough to disturb order, it became a problem. Until then, it remained personal. This approach did not eliminate wrongdoing. It minimized contagion, which is a very different objective. This is why ancient Egyptian society does not read like a culture obsessed with moral purity. It reads like a culture obsessed with equilibrium. The unsaid held the system together. People knew where lines existed even if they were not drawn loudly. They learned through example, through observation, through consequences that appeared only when needed. This created a society that was remarkably stable, but also emotionally restrained. Disagreement did not disappear. It simply did not dominate. And this restraint was intentional, because debate creates identity, and identity creates division. Ancient Egypt prioritized continuity over self-expression, which is why silence carried authority. The funniest part, perhaps, is how familiar this feels. Anyone who has lived in a large household understands this instinctively. Not every issue is addressed. Some topics are simply avoided. Not because no one notices, but because noticing does not help. Peace is maintained not by resolving everything, but by choosing what not to escalate. In that sense, ancient Egyptian morality feels surprisingly modern, just quieter and more patient. This patience extended to judgment. Moral boundaries existed, but they were not used as weapons. They were used as guardrails. Cross them too obviously, and the system responds. Stay within them quietly, and the system allows you to pass. This flexibility was not weakness, it was adaptability. And adaptability is what allowed this civilization to last as long as it did. By the end of the night, what remains is not a list of rules. It is a mood, a shared understanding that order matters more than argument. That silence can be more stabilizing than speech, that not everything needs a verdict, and that sometimes the most powerful rule is the one no one feels the need to say out loud, which gently prepares us for the final quiet step. Because once boundaries are internalized, once silence does its work, a civilization can rest. Not perfectly, but sufficiently. And sufficiency, in this world, was the highest form of success. And with that quiet understanding in place, we reach the final moments of the night. Ancient Egypt was never obsessed with pleasure. It was obsessed with continuation. What endured was not intensity, but restraint, not indulgence, but rhythm. The civilization did not ask how much life could be extracted from a moment. It asked whether tomorrow would still arrive intact. Private lives were not celebrated for their excitement. They were tolerated for their quietness. They were allowed to exist only as long as they did not make the next morning more difficult than the last. This is easy to misunderstand from a modern distance. We are used to histories driven by conflict, by turning points, by moments that demand attention. Ancient Egypt moved differently. It believed that attention itself could be destabilizing, so it lowered its voice. What mattered most was not what happened behind closed doors, but whether the doors remained closed. Not what was desired, but what could be sustained. Not what felt dramatic, but what felt repeatable. This is why so much of this civilization feels calm when we look back at it. Even its tensions were absorbed. Even its dangers were quieted. Even its ambitions were softened into routine. The system did not eliminate fear. It managed it. It did not erase uncertainty. It planned around it. And it did not promise happiness. It promised continuity. That promise required discipline. It required accepting that not every feeling needed expression, that not every conflict deserved volume, that some things were better left unrecorded so they could pass without leaving scars. Ancient Egypt understood something deeply practical. Societies do not survive on moments. They survive on nights that end without damage. On evenings quiet enough that people wake up and do the same work again. On habits boring enough to feel safe. On structures strong enough to carry ordinary lives without asking them to be extraordinary. This is why its monuments feel timeless, not because they were built to impress, but because they were built to remain. The same principle governed everything else. Endurance over excitement, repetition over spectacle, silence over declaration. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson still worth remembering. The most durable civilizations are not powered by peaks. They are sustained by nights gentle enough that nothing breaks. And when the night is calm, morning does not need to explain itself. It simply arrives, as it always hoped to.